Good evening, everybody. We are here with another presentation
Good
for
evening, everybody.
our
We are
present
here
for
with.
our winter presentation series. And tonight we have Ben Vander Ley going over the maximum known height of the major geysers. Also, as a heads up, we did add another presentation, so we will have another one in 2 weeks with Micah doing a presentation on Mickey Hot Springs. And we are working on getting another one into the schedule as well after that. So keep an eye on our website, keep an eye on our socials for additional presentations getting added to the series. And with that, we will go ahead and hand it over to Ben.
Sweet. Thank you, Will. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Vander Ley, and today I'm going to be talking about the maximum known height for many of the major geysers in Yellowstone. Also, just a huge thank you to Will and the rest of the folks behind the scenes at GOSA for getting all this organized this winter and for including me as a presenter. First, a little bit about me. I'm probably one of the newer faces of people doing a presentation this winter. I've been doing serious geyser gazing trips since 2019. But really, I've been a geyser gazer at heart since the first time I visited the park in 2005 on a family road trip. I took an interest right away in the tall geysers, and especially the big rare ones. I selected Steamboat as my favorite geyser pretty much the instant I saw this photo in the back of one of T. Scott Bryan's books, along with the caption that it could hit 386 feet. One of my greatest desires from that point onward was to be able to see it hit that height from this vantage point. So the presentation that I have tonight is going to be split into two main sections. First, I'm going to talk about geyser height measurements and how I go about taking them. What I'm not going to do is go over the very basics of how measurements work. If you're completely unfamiliar with the concept and would like to know, there are a lot of really wonderful resources on the internet that can explain it. Then after that, I'm going to be going over the geysers one by one and talk about their height and the things related to the height for each one. I have a list of geysers covered in the bottom of the screen in order, so anyone watching afterwards could pause and skip around if you want to. I know there's a lot more geysers that deserve to be on here that aren't, so if you're wondering about one that isn't here, please feel free to ask about it in the chat, and I can talk about it during the questions and answers at the end. I actually did a lot of the research for this project out of my own interest on my own time before I even signed up to present. What I've done is I've gone through the entire Geyser Gazer spot as well as the transactions looking for any references to geyser height that I could find. I took note of anything that I thought was significant. There's also a few things from Marlar's inventory in here, the USGS Norris paper, a few things from Geyser Times, the listserv archive, and a few other spots, but the majority of the stuff that I have that isn't my own comes from the first two spots. I also have not looked at the Visitor Center logbooks, the electronic versions. I know they exist and I know how to find them, but searching through those is just a really large project and it's not something I've had a chance to do yet. So it is possible that something could be sneaking around in there that I'm not aware of. Hopefully that's not the case, but it is possible. And I should also mention that it is possible with the amount of stuff that I have gone through that I could have missed something here or there. Again, hopefully that's not the case, but I thought I should mention it just in case somebody had something and I didn't include it. So onto the geyser height measurements. Inclinometers. These are the two that I use. On the left is Asunto, which is sort of what you would call the industry standard for gazing. It's a professional tool and calibrated to be accurate. It has degree marks and percent slope on it, which I will use interchangeably. It is a little bit expensive, but it's definitely what I would recommend getting if you're interested in getting into geyser height. One on the right is my homemade one. That is a stainless steel precision woodworking protractor with a nice weight at the bottom and a straight piece of aluminum L channel. I've tested it against the Sunto and it's very accurate. It actually gets more consistent results than the Sunto, which I'm very proud of. That being said, the Sunto has kind of become my go-to clinometer lately, mainly because of the convenience factor. It fits in my pocket, and I never enter the geyser basin without it. I can just pull it out at a moment's use it and use it. It is a little bit awkward to learn how to use though, and it's definitely a lot harder to hold it steady than the other one. Um, but that definitely gets a lot easier with practice. One of the baselines On the left here, we have the baseline system that a lot of the geyser gazers have been using for a while. These are little washers that are screwed into the side of the boardwalk or pavement, which are physically measured distance away from the vent. A full list of these is up on Heinrich's website. Many of these still exist, and I've even found a couple that aren't on this list. On the right here, though, is the system that I've been using. It's a series of maps that I've made, one for each of the geysers that I want to measure. Taken satellite imagery and drawn over the top of it with distance markings every 10 feet, with changes in ground elevation relative to the vent also labeled. This allows me a lot more freedom to be able to measure eruptions and enjoy them from whatever vantage point I want, just as long as I can recognize where I'm standing on the map. I should note that in some cases, my distances do differ slightly from the baselines, and a bit inconsistently where they do differ. Though I have taken a good amount of time scrutinizing the distance tool as well as the elevation data on Google Earth, and everything that I've seen in that process has pointed to both of these being fairly accurate, so I'm pretty confident in using them. Onto the calculations themselves. This is how I would record the typical height measurement in my notebook. I make sure to preserve all the important information so that it can be seen later and so that I can do the math later if I want to. I've written a spreadsheet on my phone that will do the math for me. I'll put in the angle, distance, and elevation difference, and it'll spit out the height as well as any margin of error calculations I want with whatever parameters I put in. I also have it equipped to handle slope percent and degree measurements, whichever I choose at the time. The main things I should mention here are that I always write down my angle in steps of a quarter degree or a quarter of percent slope if I'm using that. That's 0.25, 0.5, whole number, etc. I write down my distances in whole feet and occasionally put down a 0.5 if I'm particularly sure about it. I also do my elevation differences in whole feet because that's the best resolution that Google Earth has to offer. And then everything at the end gets rounded to the nearest foot for simplicity. Should also note that other people's techniques will differ from mine a little bit, which will vary the results a bit, but I'm going to be treating everyone else's measurements with the same level of confidence as my own, unless I have reason to believe otherwise. Now, onto the definitions. I'm going to briefly cover a couple definitions regarding exact top and bottom of a geyser eruption. This is something that I have not really seen nailed down anywhere. So I'm going to share the rules that I've been using. Starting with the bottom, you could just go and arbitrarily set this one at a time for each geyser wherever it makes the most sense. But I really wanted an explicit definition that you could be applied to consistently across all geysers that anyone could use. Especially with the cone geysers, I didn't want to feel like any geyser was getting a flat boost or handicap to every eruption just based on the technicality of where the line had been drawn. So the thing that I came up with that I thought was most fair for this is that the bottom of the eruption is defined as the lowest point of overflow for the venting question. And if you think about it this way, if water were to slowly rise in the vent, hypothetically, where would it begin to overflow out of the system? That exact point is what I define as the bottom of the eruption. So let's see how this applies to a few of the different geysers. First off, with every fountain geyser, it is obviously the ground next to the pool, and if that wasn't obvious, maybe you shouldn't be doing geyser heights. Up next, we have Beehive, where the rule sets it at the top of the cone, which I felt made the most sense anyway. The cone does not get included as part of the height. However, it's the opposite of Giant, where the front end being opened up would allow it to overflow out the front, and thus the height is the cone is included in the height. And a castle, for example, it's somewhere in the middle, where the spot on the back of the cone is the lowest point around the vent. I took this photo from across a river over near CGG6. The little dip between the two towers that you can see from the bike trail is a couple feet higher than it is on the backside here, so this is where it gets defined. Onto the top of the eruption, it is a little bit more obvious, but I'm going to cover it anyway. I define the top of the eruption as the highest drop of liquid water ejected at any point during the eruption. The only qualifier being that the drop of water must be large enough to fly through the air like an ordinary object. So this means that the mist kind of spray stuff that casually floats above more atomized eruptions like Beehive doesn't count. Even though you can see the individual droplets, they behave a lot more like the steam plume than the water column, so I don't count them. And with that, we're going to go on to the records. And I don't want to commit the cardinal sin of geyser gazing by starting with Old Faithful, so we're going to go with Beehive. Beehive does an excellent job of holding its height. At least half of the eruption is spent close to its maximum height, and the tallest spike is usually somewhere between 2 and 3.5 minutes in. Oftentimes, I feel like it's just a bit before the sharp drop in height that occurs close to the end of the eruption. Unfortunately, though, Beehive's water column is extremely fragile, so it can be really difficult to get an exceptional eruption out of it. On top of a strong eruption, you need very low wind, and the more times I've seen it, the more I've become convinced that you also usually need the wind to be headed somewhat to the east, essentially meaning that the edge of the eruption, which faces us in this photo here, receives as little interference as possible. Onto the height itself. The tallest modern height I'm aware of on it is my own personal best at 192, which is a bit of a surprise. I really expected to find something above 200 feet somewhere, but I just couldn't. Only height above 200 feet I'm personally aware of is the 219-foot measurement reported by the Washburn Party in 1870 by means of accurate triangulation. It sounds like they measured it. I still have a bit of a tough time trusting this one. It just seems a little bit unrealistic, especially for them only having seen one eruption. But it still seems close enough to what I think Beehive can do that it seems plausible. There's a couple of things that I think could have happened here. One option is that they were wrong. If they were, I think most likely it could be that they got their distance from the vent wrong, or also possible they could have been measuring the steam plume or the spray, which of course I don't count. Other possibility is that Beehive could have had different activity back in the day with taller eruptions, or just that they happened to get one of the most incredible Beehive eruptions ever, which, given the other things I saw on that trip, why not? Either way, for now, I don't really want to fully discount it, but I'm also a little hesitant to give it credit as being the official record. That being said, I'm pretty certain it can hit 200 feet, and would be surprised if I never eventually got one that high. On to Old Faithful. Old Faithful has had a long standing published height record of 184 feet, but as some of you know, we recently had a new record tallest. On August 14th this year, we got a height of 189 feet, taken by Ranger Dallin and Ranger David. And it sounds like it was also checked by some of the other visitor center staff. And keep in mind, the visitor center has taken thousands of measurements on Old Faithful, so a new record here is a pretty big deal. Here's a screenshot of the eruption in question from the webcam, and anyone who's seen a lot of them in the cam will tell you that this is just enormous. And on top of all of it, the conditions are just phenomenal. Huge congratulations to Ranger Dallin and Ranger David, as well as the rest of the Visitor Center staff for this. On to Giantess. Giantess is another one of the commonly listed 200-foot geysers, but the eruption strength is notoriously extremely variable. It also reaches its peak way later in the eruption than most of the other large geysers. The first couple of large series after the start, usually. And with the biggest stuff usually happening just before the steam phase, which is 40 or often a lot longer minutes in. But that's not even a guarantee. Most of the people I talked to about the recent eruption in 2021 said that day 2 was stronger than anything on day 1. Unfortunately, I really couldn't find a whole lot in terms of heights on Giantess. The tallest definitive height I could find was stated as being measured above 190 feet on July 8th, 1988. But the exact number wasn't posted, which is a bummer because I think it can hit 200 feet. If there's a measurement indicating that somewhere, I just have not been able to find it. But for now, I've got it at 190 foot plus. On to Castle. Castle fluctuates its height quite a bit during the eruption, and the tallest spike can reasonably occur at any time. From my measurements, I've identified a few different sections of the eruption in which the tallest spike could occur. The first section being the initial height from the starting surge. It doesn't always do this, where it starts with a very tall surge and then tapers off afterwards, but it does on some eruptions. The second section being a restart after a pause. Earlier on in the eruption, especially when it's deciding whether to have a major or a minor, these restarts after a false pause generally can have a lot of height to them. Once in a while, I've seen something pretty nice out of an ordinary mid-eruption spike, but that's less common. And then the next two are where you're most likely to get your absolute tallest eruptions out of Castle, which is with the transition into the steam phase and brief moments several minutes into the steam phase and onwards where water will return briefly. There's an auditory change. You can hear it coming. It's not full-bodied water, but it is large enough droplets to count. These two are where the tallest part of the eruption is likely to be for a major, with the first two being where it's likely to happen during a minor. My personal best at Castle was 112 feet during the transition to steam on July 9th last summer. This is the tallest of about a dozen or so that I've measured. It is also one of the taller ones I can remember seeing. Now, in geyser times, there is a measurement of 184 feet posted by AJ Ferreira on May 17th, 2022, which is obviously a lot higher than anything we're used to seeing out of it. I did question AJ about this eruption a little while ago, and it seems that at the very least, this was not a typo. It was genuinely an exceptionally tall eruption, just whether it was all the way up at 184 feet or not is a bit uncertain. On to Sawmill. Sawmill is a little bit out of place on this list, but I wanted to bring it up because of an eruption that I saw last year in September. I was there waiting for Uncertain with Sawmill in Eruption when suddenly it had one of the largest spikes I can remember seeing on it. It grabbed my attention, so I took an angle on it and wrote down where I was standing so that I could calculate the height when I got home. And it turns out that spike was 65 feet. I talked to Heinrich about this, and he told me that at one point years ago, he got multiple heights over 60 feet during deep drain eruptions from a non-overflowing pool. There was more than just one large spike, like I saw, which is why he pulled the clinometer out. So it is nice to see that someone else has also gotten a reading this large on it. On to Grand. Grand is another one of the 200-foot even geysers, and it's touted everywhere as being the world's tallest predictable geyser. I do take a bit of issue with that, but I'll get on more on that later. One thing I want to clear up is this notion that gets tossed around everywhere, that the second and onward bursts are always the tallest part of the eruption. While I do believe that this was true for a time, it's not really the case anymore. These days, really any of the bursts can be the tallest. I've seen the first through third all at various points hit 200 feet. And these eruptions, which are towards the upper end of what Grand can do, are absolutely incredible. Which leads us into my personal tallest, which I also believe to be the record, at 216 feet on July 6, 2022, start of a one burst. And this photo on the right here isn't even the top of that eruption. This is just the best photo I got before it went out of frame. This is the tallest of over 300 measurements I've taken on Grand so far, so while I do think it can go higher, I do think it's fairly representative of its real capabilities. The tallest measurement I could find in my research that wasn't my own was 214 feet. Moving down Basin, Daisy is a bit scary in terms of measuring heights, and a lot of that is mainly because of the extreme angle of play. The existing baselines have been made from a point underneath the tallest part for a typical eruption. That works, except for the fact that Daisy can almost double in size when it's concerted with Splendid. I'm a lot more concerned with accuracy on those taller ones than I am the normal ones, though you do still have to get the normal ones right. The other complication is that everyone I've talked to who has seen one of these larger eruptions has told me that Daisy actually straightens out a bit as it gets taller. So I can't just set a predefined angle to use on most eruptions like I can at Steamboat. It is possible that as it straightens out and gets taller, that the point underneath the top could stay somewhat stationary, but I'd really have to see one in order to know for sure. Regardless, it's something I need to figure out before I really start trying to seriously measure it. And Splendid. Splendid is another one of your commonly listed 200-foot geysers. But the thing that makes it special is that it does an excellent job of holding its height. Most people I've talked to have said it's like a big grotto fountain. And anyone who's seen grotto fountain will know that it just decides on a height and holds it there as long as it wants, and then it can change its mind, and then it'll hold it there for as long as it wants. This means if you get a 200-foot eruption as Splendid, it'll probably hold that height quite a while longer than most of the other big geysers. And of course, what you want for the biggest and best Splendids is the concert with Daisy. A concert is never the first in Splendid series, and Splendid always starts first. And historically speaking, once Daisy starts, both geysers can be energized to erupt far higher than normal, leading to what many people describe as one of the most spectacular displays in the entire park. Thankfully, we do have a record tallest measurement for both Splendid and Daisy. Marie Wolfe was well known for her affinity towards the Daisy group, and she took the record measurement for both geysers. Daisy being measured at an incredible 152 feet on a concert with Splendid sometime in the 1970s, and Splendid at 218 feet, another concert with Daisy on July 11th, 1973. In this video that I took a screenshot from on the right here, this is one of the best videos of Splendid I can find on the internet. Highly recommend watching it. On to Giant. Giant is the world's second tallest active geyser, and for a time between when Excelsior went dormant and when Steamboat began having its incredible eruptions in the 60s, it was the world's tallest. Peak happens right at the start, like a lot of the other large geysers. Main thing to talk about here is that, historically speaking, the eruptions with mastiff tend to be larger than the ones without. That being said, there have still been some really tall south function eruptions reported. We also have a known record for Giant at 271 feet, taken by Mike Keller on what I assume was a mastiff function eruption sometime in 1997. In the article I found this, Mike reports to have measured 22 eruptions of Giant in 1997 and 98, with this being the tallest one. He also reports that he's seen at least two which he thought were taller than this, but did not end up measuring them. On to Fan and Mortar. Fan and Mortar is a bit of an interesting entry in here in that this eruption is so chaotic, it's really difficult to pay attention to the entire thing all at once. I've seen several of them, and I don't think I've really paid that much attention to the actual height of any particular event at any point, at least not enough to have much of an opinion on how tall I think it is, other than that it's very big. I do intend to measure it at some point, particularly main vent and upper mortar, but for now I want to talk about something that tends to get a lot more attention than the height at fan and mortar, which is the main vent throw distance. I've often found myself looking at how far the furthest drops from main vent go, and especially whether it's cleared the trail or not. For reference, the far side of the trail is about 100 to 110 feet away from main vent, depending on where exactly the water goes. The largest one I have seen is about 130 feet. The furthest throw distance on record was on August 12th, 2014, at an estimated 205 feet from the vent. That is almost to the base of the hill behind you at Fan and Mortar. My understanding is that they estimated this with Google Earth. On to Artemisia, which is another bit kind of odd entry over here, since it's not necessarily known for its height. But there's a really interesting article in the Transactions Volume 8, and it talks about some of the historical observations of Artemisia. And in there are reports of eruptions reaching an estimated 100 feet high. This is way higher than anything we see today, but there is enough in here to substantiate that the play could have been a lot different back then, including taller eruptions. Whether it was fully 100 feet or not, who knows, but it's neat to know that it could be capable of something like that. But the main reason I wanted to bring it up is because of an eruption I saw out of it a couple of years ago. Now, I'm definitely not known for any sort of aggressive commitment to Artemisia. I usually only go for the obvious and low risk eruptions, so my sample size is pretty small. But I was watching Artemisia on July 7th, 2022, and it was an ordinary seeming morning eruption until about halfway through when we had a massive surge way above eye level. It was so large it went out of frame on my camera, which is something I never thought could happen with my camera frame the way that it was. And not only is it going out of frame in this photo, but it was still on its way up when I took this shot. I had to pull the clinometer out for this and take a measurement. I wrote down where I was sitting and tried to get a distance when I got home. From my best estimations of where on the pool that spike went, the height was 44 feet. Keep in mind that the viewing area is about 19 feet above the pool, so the typical standard for an impressive eruption of about eye level is about 25 feet. And like I said, my sample size is not huge, and this is the only Artemisia I've ever measured. But one of the handful of observers that day was Dean L., who was well known for his expertise and experience with Artemisia. He put on his Geyser Times report for the day that that was the tallest one he had ever seen. On to Great Fountain. Great Fountain is notoriously extremely variable with the height, even more so than Giantess, but its potential is enormous. It has superbursts which can reach absolutely incredible heights. Most of the people who have seen them liken it to seeing a giant start. They are rare and usually only happen at the start of the eruption. But it's because of these that when you talk about the world's tallest predictable geyser, I always argue it's Great Fountain. The tallest measurement I could find on it is somewhere between 240 and 250 feet. Again, I could not find the exact number, though I suspect it has been measured at this height multiple times. But the topic of Great Fountain brings us to an interesting article in the October 1991 Spot, The Mother of All Great Fountains. On August 7th, 1991, the author reports having seen on August 7th, 1991. The author reports having seen an eruption measured at 240 feet at some point before this one. But he says this one came up to a similar height and then sent another burst through that one even higher. The author goes so far out of his way in this article to be conservative and to account for the fact that he was excited or the fact that it could have been angled towards him, making generous adjustments to the height based off of that, and he still gives an estimate of 270 feet. I want to believe this so bad, but of course we can't know for sure. I really, really wish the author had a clinometer on hand that day. It would only mean good things for the high potential of Great Fountain, but for now I have to make it an asterisk for the current record. On to Fountain. It's another geyser where the tallest spike can happen at almost any time, up until, say, about the last 5 minutes or so. The thing that can complicate measurements here is that the spikes can really be sent out in any direction and is completely unpredictable. That means you're either working with a much bigger margin of error than I would like to work with, to be honest, or you have to measure from further away, which in part is why I have not really done a whole lot of height measurements on it. I also have not really found a lot of heights taken for Fountain. So if there's anything really noteworthy on it out there, I'm not aware of it. Tallest one I have is 80 feet, and it's the tallest of only a handful I've measured. So we're kind of in this awkward position with Fountain, where the tallest one I know about is 80 feet, but I really don't think it's all that good of a record, and honestly, I suspect it can do 100 feet or more. And that's not even counting the duels with Morning, which I suspect also could be stronger than the normal ones. Regardless, I feel like I kind of have to leave it at 80 foot plus for now. And Morning. Morning is yet another one of the geysers typically listed at an even 200 feet. Its height is also quite variable, but it depends a lot more on the mode. Trifecta with Fountain and Morning's Thief generally tend to be the weakest, but also the longest lasting in recent years. And the duels with Fountain being somewhat in the middle, and the solos are what you really want for a powerful eruption. My understanding is that even with a solo, you want there to have been a long time since the last event in the system, either Fountain or Morning, for a better chance at a strong eruption. And the tallest height I could find was somewhere around 130 feet, but I know it can go a lot higher than this. This is a photo that I've hacked together from one of the best videos of Morning on YouTube, a solo on June 21st, 2012. Towards the end of the video, this spike occurs, and I'm not necessarily sure whether it was Terra or someone else operating the camera. But regardless, they had to point the camera way high in the air to get the whole thing in frame. And if this doesn't look impressive enough, look closely at the foreground. You'll notice that this wasn't even taken from the closest point to morning on the boardwalk. This was taken from all the way back at the bottom of the stairs, and the camera still had to be pointed up as high as it was. There was some debate on the listserv about this eruption and some of the other ones in 2012 about whether they were really 200 feet or not. But to be honest, I'd be really surprised if it weren't. On to Morning Steve. This one's going to be a bit brief because there really aren't many heights taken on it, but it is deceptively large. As far as I know, I currently hold the record at 85 feet, but I know for sure I've seen taller than this. This is just the first really good one I've gotten since I started measuring it. I'm also definitely not known for any commitment to the fountain group either, especially with morning not being active, so my sample size isn't really that big. The reason I think the height is so deceptively large here is that it's just so far away from the boardwalk for a geyser of its size. If you think about the pool when viewed from the overlook, how far do you think it is across? I would have originally thought 5 or 6 feet, but it turns out it's more like 10 feet. That means when you get an eruption out of it that's a few times taller than it is wide, that's already like 40 feet. And those are the normal ones. And of course, last but not least, I save Steamboat for the end. I have an article in the April 2021 spot going over Steamboat heights from this recent active phase and its height characteristics. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go and check out that article. Something I need to mention here that will be important for later is that it's distinctly angled towards the north. And you need a good way to account for that. If you measure from Emerald, for example, and you don't do anything to account for that north vent angle, you'll wildly overestimate the height. And if you measure from Decker, which is my favorite spot to see it, and you don't do something about that angle, you'll wildly underestimate the height. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the article, but this is the system that I've been using. But rather than the height characteristics, what I want to talk about with Steamboat today is this. The long-standing 386-foot figure, since it played such a large role in getting me interested in this geyser. And that brings us to this. An eruption on Christmas Day, 1962. Nearly every source for this eruption I've seen listed at 381 feet. But this is the closest matching height I could find to 386, and I suspect this is where that came from. On the right, you can see this is actually a photo of that eruption that can be found on the YNP digital slide file website. This was only the 5th modern day eruption recorded out of it, so it's interesting that this occurred before the 60s even really got going. And since the 60s, there have been a few more eruptions that have been speculated higher than this, but none with an actual measurement attached to them. A good example would be the July 10th, 1964, that Jack Crellin has a wonderful description of in one of the spot articles. This is a photo of that eruption on the right, and the Crellin family actually has another photo of this eruption, which is not in this spot. That's a lot closer to the peak height for that eruption, and I've seen this photo, and it looks a part of 400 feet for sure. Another interesting example would be August 26, 1978. It was notoriously reported 5 to 6 times the height of the trees. The sources I found for this will differ for what they call that. Some say 90 to 120 meters, and one says 137 meters, which is 449 feet. Even though this is just complete speculation on their part, it's nice that they attach some numbers to it, and I feel like the numbers are actually pretty plausible. But after the start of the 2018 active phase, several more eruptions would be assumed to be above 400 feet, and I agree with many of them. But it wouldn't be until August 27th, 2019, where we would know for sure, when Heinrich would get a measurement of 405 feet. Heinrich also admits that the sun was in his eyes a little bit, and that he may not have gotten the highest drops. That combined with differences between the way that he did his baseline versus the way I do my baseline lead me to believe that this eruption was certainly not any less than this and probably a healthy amount taller. And for anyone wondering, this is not a photo of the August 27th eruption. This is a different eruption, the July 9th, 2020. I chose this eruption for this slide mainly because it was a somewhat similar height and somewhat similar conditions with the start time of the exact same minute. And moving on to my personal favorite eruption of all time, Steamboat on June 23rd, 2020. I had seen Steamboat already in 2019, but it wasn't until 2020 when I would actually try to measure it. This was the first one I successfully managed to catch from Decker, and I was completely overwhelmed. It was just so much more incredible than I ever thought it could be, so much taller than I ever pictured it being. I took an angle on it, and after the start of the steam phase, I punched the numbers into my calculator to calculate the height without worrying about the angle of north vent. I knew that whatever I got on the calculator, that this eruption was guaranteed to be taller than that. And well, this is a screenshot I took on my phone that morning. 386 feet. This is everything I had ever wanted out of Steamboat, all in one perfect eruption. I burst into tears when I saw this. Now, after adjusting for the angle of north vent, it would come to a new record of 429 feet. But I didn't actually figure out this system for adjusting for the angle of north vent until almost the end of August that year. So I would not know that this was a new record until it had already been overshadowed by an even taller eruption. July 19th. Less than a month later, get to see it again, from the exact same location, during the exact same conditions, with the start time of the exact same minute of the day. Except this time, I wasn't left to wonder whether I might have the record on my hands or not. I knew it was certain. The only things going through my head when I saw the top of this eruption were: one, this is taller than June 23rd, and two, this is well above 400 feet. I've looked over a lot of footage of other steamboat eruptions from this active phase, and this one holds its own against every other eruption, which I regard as extremely tall based on the footage alone. Is it the absolute tallest? I don't think you can really say, but it's darn close. What I can say is that this is the sort of record that I think a geyser like Steamboat deserves. And with that, we're on to the Q&A.
I have one to start you off here, Ben. Have you
Sure.
at all looked at some of the photos of Semi-Centennial?
I have not been able to see photos of Semi-Centennial, and I really would like to, so no comment there, really.
Okay. I'll go ahead and ask another one here while we wait for some others. Um,
Sure thing.
there's always been the story of at Grand that three separate people recorded the exact same eruption and got wildly different heights. Have you been able to kind of cross verify on same eruptions or like be able to figure out why those kind of instances have happened?
As far as why instances like that could have happened, I'm not exactly certain. I think it could be down to some of the differences between the different baselines that they may have been using. I know one of the baselines that exists for Grand is pretty far off of the measurements that Google Earth will give you. I've not done a whole lot of trying to corroborate my measurements with other people's measurements at the same time, and a lot of that is just because I'm kind of alone right now in terms of frequently measuring heights. There was one trip that I did where I did have a friend measure Grand from a completely different angle than I did. We got within a couple feet of each other, which I was very happy to see. But outside of that, Not really.
Nice. Well, we'll wait here for oh, here's another question for you. From Micah, is there an ideal wind direction slash conditions for? Of course, it's showing an icon over it. For Steamboat, like there is for Beehive.
I would say yes, but in a bit of a different way. So the ideal wind for Steamboat is just pretty much anything that lets you see it. And my favorite wind direction would be the one that I had for June 23rd, which is basically straight away from the platform where this photo was of this miner was taken. The thing about Steamboat is it's really not as susceptible to the wind as some other geysers. Of course, it can be knocked over by the wind and has in the past. But the way that it's positioned in the forest allows it some coverage from the wind in the bottom portions of the eruption. It's located in a spot in the park that does not tend to get as much wind as the upper geyser basin. And on top of that, the default wind direction during the day is pretty much the same direction as the water being ejected from North Vent. So most of the time, you're not really going to have a conflict there. And on top of that, you also have South Vent upwind to shield North Vent partially for the bottom half to 2/3 of the eruption. So pretty much the only requirement is that you can see it and that it's not gale force wind.
Okay. Got another. Uh, are there any record minimum heights of great flounder? In Dimitri corrects that to fountain.
Uh, there probably are. If there's any that were posted in the spot and other places like that, I probably skimmed over it. I know my smallest is somewhere around 60 feet though.
Those diagrams that you have done for kind of creating your on-the-fly baselines, are those available anywhere for anybody to see?
Right now, I have not published them. I've just kind of shared them via email to people who are interested. I suppose I could consider putting them up somewhere, but at the moment, no.
Okay. If you ever do, feel free. I think there's multiple entities that would be willing to help you out there. So, another question from Blake Hoffer. Hey Ben, what are your thoughts on using digital inclinometers that are common on modern cell phones to grab some ballpark measurements if you don't have an analog one with you?
Those will probably work really well, actually. I prefer the physical tool, but the instruments that are on your typical smartphone, uh, they're probably not quite as accurate as a clinometer, but they'll definitely get the job done. You just might have a slightly larger margin of error than what I would have.
Gotta make sure you're looking down the cell phone screen right, is all I'm
Mhm.
thinking.
Yeah, the other thing you can do is with some of them that you can probably take a screenshot of the crosshairs on the top of the geyser and then just record it later. So I mean, there are some advantages to that too.
uh, have another one from Brandon. In TSB's 5th edition of the Geysers of Yellowstone, Abyss Pool is registered to have heights of 50 to 100 feet. How accurate do you think these numbers are, and did someone get a measurement?
So with Abyss specifically, I can't really comment too well, but on a lot of those heights that you see in T. Scott Bryan's book and a lot of the heights that you'll just find in general, those are going to be a lot of them just general estimations that people give, and those are going to vary in terms of accuracy, in terms of usually, for one thing, who's doing the estimating. As everyone's interpretation of a foot without actually something to measure it is going to be a little bit different. So, for the most part, you can generally trust these measurements as like a loose sort of guideline. So if they say that Abyss was somewhere between 50 and 100 feet, I would buy it. That's a pretty big range. And who knows? I mean, I didn't see it. I've seen one video of Abyss, which did not look like it reached that high, but there's probably, that's definitely not the only eruption to have occurred. And I've also done my own just visual estimates on plenty of other geysers that I haven't bothered to put an angle on before. So take it with a grain of salt, but you can trust them to some extent.
Okay, I have no further ones right now. We'll go ahead and just give it another minute here for any lingering questions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can find something for that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, I'll be trying to find a decent resource somewhere that can cover the very basics of height measurements and exactly the procedure that you should follow, and we'll be putting that in the comments or description or somewhere in the video. Or maybe up on the GOSA website. I don't know.
Maybe both. Okay, so it looks like we don't really have any other questions come up. If you do after the presentation, feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to get Ben to answer your questions. And we will have another presentation next week on the 9th from one of our sister organizations, Geyser Times, and going over some of the history and where Geyser Times is maybe looking to take the platform in the future. And as a reminder, we are adding a couple presentations, so if you haven't picked up those updates, we will also have one, possibly two more past Jake's presentation next week. So keep an eye on our website, keep an eye on the schedule, and we will see you guys all next time.